Climate and health are, as you well recognise in OraTaiao, really a single issue. It's impossible to imagine people living genuinely healthy lives in an unhealthy planet or in an unhealthy community. So the synthesis of the two in your name should, I think, give everyone a guide to how to think about these things and, more importantly, how to act. Thought and action are not, of course, in any meaningful sense, separate things. They go together for any sentient being, that is, things which can feel and sense are conscious, with the only purpose of thought really being to guide action. And the separation of people from nature, that dualism, is a false concept which has some analytical value, but which requires integration to make practical sense. I often think that Taha Mason Jury's model of Hauora, the now familiar Taha Wairua, Taha Hinanaru, Taha Tinana, and Taha Whānau, is clearly conceived in a physical form as a whare, locating the model in the physical realm at the heart of human interaction with the nature of which we're part. There's no separation in this vision. Tangata, whenua, and whare, one along, of course, with Wai and Ahuarangi. And that's so despite the Jury Hauora model these days being slapped on so many diverse activities and reports, etc., that it becomes in danger of becoming a slogan or a brand rather than an insight and a guide to action. And I think that if we reflect more deeply about that conceptual structure, it will be very valuable to how we think about the health system. Now, to me, there are a lot of quite deep-seated reasons why we experience our health system the way we do. And a lot of that's beyond my brain, but I can clearly see two vital things that I wanted to mention tonight. First, many of us are dealing with big financial or operational issues in the health system, and those dominate thinking at all levels, but they're always symptoms of much deeper issues. They exacerbate some things, and they're huge obstacles, for example, to reaching Paora, but there are no solutions, only panacea when you think about it, in issues of funding and efficiency in the delivery of services. And I think the more I've pondered on it, that's because we think about these issues inside out. We look at the systems we have created and try to respond to the issues the systems present. But we look out, even if we're able to do that, towards the causes and conditions of the issues. In other words, we're framed in our thinking by the problems, not by the causes of the problems. So I think we have to shift our thinking base from, if you like, the hospital looking out towards the whare, but even beyond the whare to the whenua and to taia more widely. And we all know that the world looks very different depending on where you stand. So it's one thing to be looking from that physical base within our hospitals and other institutions towards the wider world, when we should really be looking from the perspective of te taia, to the whenua, to the whare, to the whānau, to the health system, and not the other way around. And to me, if we can make this mental shift, it will promote a very different way to approach the health system. It was certainly my experience, and certainly the areas that I worked in the health system for a short time, that it was very dominated by models and structures and processes that were already extant and were themselves causing some of the problems, rather than, as I say, looking from the outside in. And if you do that inversion process and think about it in that context, it appears frankly ridiculous that we would pursue an enormous endeavor in technical sophistication and operational complexity and see that as the main thing we should be doing. And add to that only the ability to create around it some sustainability programs to ameliorate some of the most egregious impacts on te taia. And Victoria, I can see you on there, and I'm very glad you're doing that sustainability job and doing it really well. But in many ways, as you're very well aware, those programs can be used for just this purpose. And if you start doing this outside in mental exercise, and if we could persuade our politicians and our directors and our managers to start doing that outside in mental exercise, you would then see automatically how vital protecting, repairing damage to, and working to our natural environment is for Paora, because that's where it all starts. The long-term thinking and planning has to start, not end there. The rest of the system can't be left aside, but it should be approached in that context. I think the thing you'll find next is, if you do that inversion, that the next layer of vital actions becomes public health issues, because they're the ones that are closest to the perspective of OraTaiao. The actions we take consistent with the interests of the natural environment to promote and protect human health, with adequate water, food, housing, social support, and interaction are the next layer. And it's ridiculous now when I think back and think that we thought we could reach Paora really in abstraction from those vital components of health. You might even find, if we could do this, that a future chair of Te Whatu Ora gets congratulated, not sacked, for calling a policy which adversely affects both the natural element of water and its human use stupid, because we would all agree that it was. It surely is stupid if you're thinking about health from the outside in. Then it naturally follows from that you will think about the multiple clinical and care services in the community which will require to be required, though in lesser amounts than currently, if proper attention has been paid to what we like to call the social determinants of ill health. How do these fit with this view of the world and the way we've approached public health? Would we construct them in the same way? And I think the answer to that you'll clearly see is no, we wouldn't. We wouldn't see them as adjuncts to the centre of the health system. We would see them as growing out of the natural environment. And hospitals, which will of course still be vital for severe health conditions and events, respond to what is not met there. They're the residual service, not the centre. So the overriding order of priorities would then match what we know to be the real order of things for health services. OraTaiao leads, and through this Paora can be created, and it can't really be created the more I think about it working in the reverse. And right now, that's the way it works. It's the other way around. Now, some might consider that fanciful, but in practice, it seems to me that unless the comprehension of health services is turned inside out, then there will be no Paora, and the system will continue to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution to the climate and health crises we're beginning to experience. This will make disgraceful events like backtracking on smoking laws just part of a pattern of failure to act on what we know. Those inactions and actions form part of a wider pattern of health political control, management, and governance in the service of profit over people and place. It seems to me we can all see this, and many like you much more clearly and quickly than me, I'm sure, as we work within the present system. And it is tempting for many to despair. But I do urge you not to allow your skill and care to be lost, because we have to push for radical change while that daily work is going on. This is not also to sort of suggest that we just retreat to being utopian, but anyone who's thinking radically about anything needs a framework to operate in, to avoid despair and to keep on track. And I think there are some pieces of thinking going on within the system that allow positive things that can be done consistent with this. While it has all the limitations I've been describing, I read in the last couple of days a World Health Organization publication. Now, I know the current government doesn't seem to like the World Health Organization all of a sudden as well, but I still consider them a useful contributor to health issues. there's a new publication out just last week on an operational framework for building climate resilient and low carbon health options, which is worth reading if you haven't had the chance to see it. And they seek to improve this and identify what they say is 5% of global emissions coming from health sectors more globally. And it runs through a structure of, again, what they call components, which run from leadership and governance. Interesting to me that was the number one issue that they were focusing on, through a climate smart workforce, assessment of risks and emissions, tracking and monitoring the sort of things that you might do, research, but also integrating emergency procedures and financing into that. It's well worth it. It's quite an interesting model to observe for what could be done in the interim while we are moving to what I would consider a more holistic service. And of course, being the WHO, it might well get ignored, I suppose. So what I would say to your group is that I urge you to maximise your voice as activist health people. Be insistent on holistic health issues with everyone as you can, seeking safety in numbers and your professional organisations as you can. In my experience, it's easy to assume that people who nod or acquiesce understand or agree with change programs. But under pressure, what you often find is that you've overestimated this. It's been easy to be part of a sustainability program or a green labelled health exercise in the past. I think it's going to get harder. Provoking reaction, even negative reaction, will be part of building, not a reason to hold back. So you should be pushing further. So what I urge on you is to push to have Te Taia at the centre of Te Pai Tata, not as an adjunct, not as something nice to have, but as the guiding force. That far more closely matches reality than what we have devised in the absence of that direction. We've been looking inside out and not outside in, and I think it's the wrong way. Now, the system will try to fence such thinking in. It'll point to minor advances it's making in emissions or recycling, all of which are good. But they're ultimately decorations on a health system which is abstracted from natural reality. And that's an approach which I would suggest has failed. Health workers are powerful not just in the health system, but in the wider community. So to me, climate and health activism are the same cause. So the main point I want to do is to thank you for the work you're doing to advance this understanding and offer any support I can offer to that cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you for the kind words for us as well. Now, the floor is open for questions. I've just put a comment in the chat. In order to ask a question, just use that raised hand icon in reactions, not the thumbs up, but the raised hand when you go to the top of the screen, and you can verbally ask the question, or if you would like to hear me reading out your question, you can pop it in the chat. I'll charge a minimal fee for doing that. But while you're all thinking of questions, because I'm sure you have some. Oh, Victoria's in first. I have a question, but I will. I was hoping to ask it before anyone was ready. I spoke too slowly. Victoria, away you go.
I want to let you have the floor. Can you hear me well enough? Yeah, great. I often have issues with Zoom. Kia ora, Rob. I just appreciate your frankness, and please keep being vocal. We need you. My question is more around, so if I put on my Te Pata Water hat, which I don't often, I take on and off at this meeting, as I'm sure you understand, what would you expect from us? So the sustainability function, the things that you mentioned, like emissions reduction commentary and recycling, which I completely agree with your comments there. From the inside, do you have any suggestions or ideas of ways we can shake the bars, I guess, from a functional perspective? That's probably quite a loaded question, but Kia ora.
Kia ora, Victoria, and I do thank you for the work. I know you and the team working on these things are doing, and you're really to be congratulated on that. And I think unfortunately, I think it will probably get harder as even more pressure comes on the health system. But I hope I'm wrong about that. My experience, not just in Te Whatu Ora, which isn't exceptional in many ways, is that the more you can organise local groups of staff members to take action around any issues to do with climate and health, the better it is. I think that's the key to it, is activating groups within the organisation. It's important to provide a framework, as I've sort of talked about, for that. But I think that's one critical element, and I know currently there is work going on to do that, and OraTaiao certainly is helpful in that too. But I am a bit struck, I have to say, by this idea of looking outside in, and whether that could be sold to the leadership in some way. And I did find in that, in thinking about it, I did find that WHO framework that I've talked about one that might be usefully adopted, because it requires basically all of the activities of the health system to refer to climate issues, and it does integrate them in a kind of way. As it's far from perfect in my view, but it's a kind of structure I think one could imagine leadership in Te Whatu Ora adopting and providing some framework for you. Otherwise, what I fear is that all the effort just goes into individual actions, which none of them are bad in themselves, as you know, but it really doesn't promote change. And the change really is not what you can knock off the emissions themselves, but the change is getting to a health system which is itself based on the kind of issues I've been discussing, and I know OraTaiao discusses, which is that more holistic view of health. So now that's not something that's necessarily going to resonate with the new political regime, but equally, I don't see why not. There's nothing particularly left about this. Simply, I think, a more practical reaction to the environment in which we live in. So I'm sort of hopeful that that could be done. I don't think it has to be seen as a left or right issue. It's probably vital that it's not. So the two things: try and sell them better models. The leadership is currently hung up on a model of Paora, which is very much a top-down one, let alone outside in. So I think that work has to continue, but equally, just whatever activism you can do is helpful.
Can I add to that question and just ask your experience within when you were in Te Whatu Ora? I'll put my GP hat on here for a second, and as you're saying, that kind of outside-in influence and so on, where would you see the role within sustainability, sort of, and that flowing into primary care? Where would you see the role of primary care would have in the sort of wider healthcare sustainability question? GPs and primary care clinicians in general feel particularly sidelined, I think, since the, well, for many years, but during the health sector reforms as well. And maybe within the sustainability push within Te Whatu Ora, we also feel a little bit left out. Do you see a particular role for general practice in primary care, and if so, what?
So my experience in Te Whatu Ora, and this is on the basis that I failed to change anything there, was that it is very hierarchical, and the people at the centre do think very much from that perspective. So everything else is a challenge. It was quite a battle to get any recognition of sustainability into to Paitata and into the operations since then. And then the effort is to, and this is, I found this in every organisation I've been in, incidentally, so Te Whatu is not different. You resist it, then you try and compartmentalise it and keep it off from the core parts of what you're doing, make it a nice to have. And frankly, I can't think of an organisation, even where we've introduced some quite holistic means of doing it. You know, one business I was in, we adopted a future fit model, which was pretty holistic, but actually hasn't been adopted in its fullness as time has gone on. So again, if I was working in OraTaiao or trying to do this work in the health system, I would probably start from the edges in. What appear to be, well, I mean, I'm arguing they're not the edges, of course, but what are currently the edges in. And I think that's a bit emblematic of everything I see happening in the health services. I think the most promising innovations are actually taking place outside of the most centralised parts of the health system, in primary care and community care and kaupapa Māori services are one example of it, but there are lots of others as well. So there is more flexibility out in the what people like to call the funded sector when they're sitting in the middle, that external thing that's always demanding money and not doing what you want it to. So that's the place where I think progress will be made, where people are working close to the ground with one another and close to Taia, because the world just Pete, you underestimate, I think, how different the world looks from a few floors up in an office building. So the revolutionary part of me, which is probably half a century ago, thinks of that in terms of taking the countryside to surround the towns, which I think might have been Mao Zedong's slogan when he was a guerrilla.
A nice image. Other questions from anyone? I have one more I would like to ask, but Isabella, kia ora.
Tēnā koe. Tēnā koe, Rob. Thank you so much for your kōrero. I just have a question about, I'm interested in hearing your kind of picking up on the points you raised around kind of how we pivot in light of the changing kind of nature of this government and the changing priorities. What do you think that means for kind of organizations like OraTaiao, but also other organizations kind of working in kind of progressive change, in terms of not like feeling like there can be some progress made? Or do you think that we have to go fully back to the basics and just like, I mean, it seems that we're just trying to hang on to very basic structures like te tiriti, like, you know, the foundation of our society, and we can't progress on anything given the fact that we're in this like global crisis. Like, how do we reconcile this time? And what do you think is going to be most useful in terms of our time and resources kind of going forward?
This is almost like a deathbed confession, Isabella, but I've always been of the view that we had to try and kind of influence things from the top, because the top is where the power is. I think what we're learning, and certainly what I'm learning, is that that's a false view, and the majority of energy and activism has to go on in the community at the flax roots or ground level or factory floor, whatever you like to call it. And I mean, as it happens, I was talking to John Tamahiri from Te Pāti Māori today and talking about their political strategy. And it struck me that consistent with that, they, for example, had decided that they should put all of their effort into electorate votes and not worry about the party vote that they got in the most recent election, because where they could make progress was there. And it's a bit of the same sort of argument, really. And I haven't talked to Green Party people about it, but I'm going to, because I think whether implicitly or explicitly, that was probably part of them also placing increased spend and effort and energy and concentration in some electorates, because that was building on community base and community work that they had. And so to me, I think we're now entering into an era where the more activism is based, what seems to be lower in the chain, but I guess I'm arguing here tonight's the opposite. It's going to be a much better potential to change, I think. Yeah, so that's a very late realization in my life, but I still think it's right. It just means I've wasted a lot of time. But that, yeah. So, for example, if I had more youth and energy, I would not have taken on the role even at Whatu, not because of difficulties I had, but because I think I had a false impression of where it was important to try and make the difference.
Thank you. That's a really good question. Excellent answer. Kate, kia ora.
Thank you very much, Rob. That's been a very insightful commentary, I think, and a couple of the really key points and things that we can perhaps do is around our collectivism. And I'm sorry, Kate Western College of Nurses, to be actually able to be collaborative, have some key messaging that OraTaiao as an organisation can put out, but how we actually keep those key messages going in a more widespread way, because certainly and I think the way Aotearoa handled the pandemic was actually an example of what you've spoken about, of the strength and the innovation in primary and community is what actually largely got us through a pandemic. And collectivism and having similar messages and repeating them and continuing to make noise is something that we can do. And it might only be as annoying as sort of water on a rock, but eventually, hopefully, people will listen. So thank you for your wisdom this evening and your time, Rob. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kate. I do think, if I could just, doesn't really require an answer because it's a really good statement. I do think that effort to ensure that all of the myriad health organisations, be they professional or union or interest group or whatever they are, the more OraTaiao can influence their models of thinking, the better it is. And there's probably more traction there because you're dealing with people who are not looking inside out rather. You're probably going to make more traction and develop more support and influence that way. And Victoria will handle the insight for you.
Got our people on the inside. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Our man or woman in Havana. Anyone else? Can I ask a quick question, which is something I've done a bit of thinking about. It's not necessarily specifically about climate change or even sustainability or environmental matters, but I suppose brought to the fore a little bit as well with the current Minister for Health supporting repealing anti-smoking legislation and standing over increased take from cigarettes and the undoubted deficit that will cause for tax cuts for people who don't need them. So something that is completely medically unethical. So where there's a conflict between what someone, and he is in a position where he can choose between the two. I think that is, but where someone is in a job where they are required to either enact or turn a blind eye to policy or behavior or whatever that would ordinarily go against the ethics of their job, and how to reconcile that. It's not the problem I personally have at the moment, but there will be people on the call who will work in organizations where this will arise. And I know with your time in Te Whatu Ora, it is something that obviously came up as well. Have you any insights for us around that?
Yeah, Dermot, I've fooled myself often and for long years into thinking that I'm compromising on that, but I am doing some better thing over here. And that's well before I got anywhere near to Whatu Ora. And as I reflect on it now, that's been significantly a mistake. It's much more comfortable to do. We're very good humans at inventing stories that justify our comfort. And I've been as guilty of that as anyone. But the more people can persuade themselves to step outside of comfort zone, the better. You can see it at the moment. There are people in right through the public service who are appalled by some things that are being suggested, but equally they're feeling that I get probably, at the moment it's running at about 3 a day. Earlier, straight after I left Whatu Ora, it was more from people within the system saying, I agree with what you say, but I'm afraid to speak out because I'll lose my job. And I accept, I think those people are very genuine, and they have done a summation of, can I put up with this? And they're hurting badly. By the time someone writes to a stranger like me to say that, you are hurting quite badly. And it's one of the shames of this whole structure, I think. And I haven't helped that, because I've been a person who obviously, probably right through my working life, has obviously been in positions where I wasn't that comfortable about some things, but I thought I was achieving something for it. I think I was probably kidding myself most of the time, but damn it.
Thank you. And thank you for the honesty around it. I think it's unfortunately something that probably come to the fore with the current government more and more. Simon, kia ora.
Evening, everyone. I've already put my question in the chat, but Rob, you have a diverse background. You know a little bit about the health sector. You know about a little bit about the business sector, unions, all sorts of different organizations and networks. So people who might belong to OraTaiao, are there organizations or networks or sectors that you think there are actually opportunities to work with for health and climate that we wouldn't normally think of? Some unusual combinations, some unusual coalitions that we, because often those are the ones that can actually create change in unexpected and powerful ways.
I think I must be in a very depressed mood tonight, so I'm not easy to think of them. But can I just touch on one area that I'm disappointed in? So I'm Chancellor at AUT, and we're probably the biggest health services educating organisation. And we have some, like elsewhere in the health system, we have some very talented people, well-meaning people, driven people, really. But I think our education is very much directed towards serving the beast, if you like, rather than making change. And so if I really encouraged you to go somewhere, it would be to try to influence more the nature of the education being offered to younger people coming through. I don't know that's the long way round, but
what's your sense of morale in the tertiary education sector? I mean, there's lots of academics I know have been losing their jobs, and
yeah, well, it's the same. It's the same funding and structural problems that we have in health are just repeated there. But even so, that's that's another pressure that everyone there has. But it's not an excuse for not having a challenging view of education rather than just a provision of qualified people view of education. So I think there could be a lot more in the courses I observe, and this is for all tertiary institutions, a lot more that made people think about their role rather than just acquire the technical skills. So that's a suggestion. Yeah. I'm aware of, no, it's probably all I should say about that, yeah.
Really want to hear the last part there, Rob, I think.
An uncharacteristically cautious part of my talk.
Deborah has just put the comment in the chat to Simon's question. Iwi and Tangata Whenua have the vision and holistic and future thinking. That is an area.
Oh, yeah, without doubt. And I think there's room there. My observation of Māori working within the health sector is that they get all of this. Most of the people I meet and talk to get all of this, but they are so driven by the pressures on their people that anything other than trying to serve those people is really hard for them to focus on, particularly because they usually have other iwi or whānau or hapu obligations on top of it. So they literally, my observation is that many Māori in the system are really driving themselves into the ground. So the ability to hook them into yet another network, I think, possibly might be a bit limited.
Imogen, would you like to ask your question? Kia ora.
Hi, yeah, I'm Imogen. I work at an organisation called ACC, so it's quite large, and
yeah, I've heard of that.
We are working quite closely with HQSC in some areas, and we recently went to the HQSC Quality Symposium, and there's a really big movement. We had Professor Jeffrey Braithwaite speaking from Macquarie University, and so he's a champion for health system change and leadership, management, quality, safety, sustainability. He did actually present on climate change and talked about how the health system is the biggest, contributor and also will suffer the most harm in terms of, climate crisis. And I guess I just wondered what your thoughts were regarding whether sort of the quality and safety route is a good, aspect of the health system where you think there's a big potential to sort of push the sustainability message.
Yeah, it's interesting. It could well be, and HQSC has that sort of. I really like. Haven't heard of that professor, but the HQSC, has that relative degree of independence, which I think is useful in this stuff. So, look, it could well be. There's actually a lot of discussion and activism developing amongst the health and safety ranks of people who are doing that kind of work, and you may, in your role, you may well be aware of this, but quite a bit of dissatisfaction amongst many of the professionals in that area of being continually kind of herded back into a quite limited safety kind of role. And they're always trying to break out into a much wider view of health. And I am aware of some, as you mentioned it, I am aware of some that, whether there's a network, I don't know, but there are certainly people who are trying to push that out into a broader environmental view and taking the kind of view that I've talked about. So that potentially is an area where you could find some very good allies. Unfortunately, a lot of people are being squeezed out of there who made some progress. What happened there is probably quite instructive. Is, you know, most companies would say they had made some advances in health and safety, and they have. And the only reason they have is that personal liability was placed on directors. And we all owe a big vote of thanks to the late Helen Kelly for really spearheading that, because once directors actually had something, they all suddenly became a whole lot more interested in health and safety once they were personally responsible for adverse outcomes of it. And, you know, I have idly wondered whether applying the same thing to some directors and governors in the health system would have an effect as well. So there are obligations you can't insure away. So actually, you're quite right, as I think about it, Imogen. The people working in this area of health and safety probably are really good allies for this, because they immediately get it. You know, they do understand these things pretty well. Yeah. The other people who increasingly, again, it might not be a good environment for them, but you know, I did previously work in the Environmental Protection Authority, and not necessarily the authority, which is quite small, but if you thought about people working in environmental science, looking towards health work, they are also people who are natural allies for what OraTaiao is doing and thinking about. So you're probably, the more I think about it, you're right. It's a good idea. Of course, the funny thing is, isn't it, that you could do a whole reform of the health system and leave ACC out of it. What on earth the people thought they were doing when they excluded that huge part of our health system from consideration in developing the PAORA legislation? Still just beyond me. I've never had anyone able to explain it to me. Mind you, they left the entire private sector out as well. So it was a reform of the health system that excluded about 3/4 of the system.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. I'm just kind of have one eye on the clock, Rob. I don't want to take up your entire evening, although we would, I'm sure. Toughest question of the night here is from Pete. What's currently bringing you joy and hope?
Look, the fact that I do perceive that there are tremendous things happening in our communities, in health, social services, everywhere I go. I'm lucky to be able to go to a lot of places and see what community groups are doing and how they're fighting back against their difficulties, or just dealing with their difficulties. That's the best thing. But you know, I'm too dominated by the sort of big and depressing things, I guess. But when I see the glimmers of light are all in the communities that I see and observe those things happening.
Superb. Very good. Any final questions? I said we'd be about 40 to 45 minutes, Rob. So we've blown out past that. I apologise.
That's okay. You've got an AGM still to have, I think, haven't you?
We do, yeah. That'll be everybody here who came to listen to you is now going to have to stay. Excellent. Okie dokie. We will leave it there. I thank you for coming along. Thank you for your wisdom and sharing your experiences and your experience. I think it's really good to hear from you.
Thank you. And I genuinely mean thank you for what you're doing, the work you're doing to bring health and Taiao together is just absolutely critical. If we don't have that, there aren't technical answers to these problems we're having. There are only holistic answers to them.
And yeah, I obviously completely agree. And I think the shame is that we often feel like we're pushing things uphill a lot of the time. It tumbles back to where we started. Yeah. But I think maybe bit by bit we'll get there.
It does feel like that when you're pushing things uphill. It feels like you're pushing things uphill too.
That's right. Very good. Thank you very much. I hope to hear from you. We keep a keen out for you on the radio. Heard you yesterday on Morning Report. My wife said, that's Rob Campbell. He's always a good person to listen to. So I totally be here tonight. So there you go.
It's very kind. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Good night. Good night.
Good night. Kia ora.